Hey everybody, welcome. Tonight we're going to talk about origins of wine in California, and this is for video 304 wine components at Folsom Lake College. Okay, so we can't really even begin to have the conversation about wine and origins and history of California without actually honoring the natives that were there first. A lot of times we have a lot of discussion about the gold rush and even Spanish conquistadors and the age of exploration, all those things. And those are things we're going to talk about today, but it's very important that we recognize the Native Americans that were here before any of that, right? So before any European settlement, California was actually an amazingly diverse state before it became a state, right? That was full of different Native American tribes. There were a ton of different tribes. They all lived amongst each other, had different languages and cultures, but found ways to share resources and essentially live together, right? Currently today, only 109 out of 575 tribes are actually federally recognized in the state of California. So almost just about 1/5, right, of the total, which is crazy. Hopefully that can change over time, right? In 1769, there was an estimated 310,000 natives living in California. By 1900, less than 20,000 natives survived. Fast forward to 2026, we have around 750,000 to 950,000 natives living in California. However, the numbers are skewed because the majority of those are from out of state or indigenous Mexican, Central American tribes. A very, very small amount of that is actually surviving California native. So we don't really know what the numbers are because of the way that the census and how we collect that data, we don't really know exactly how many California specific natives. At least I can't access that information, but I know it's very small, right? So Native Californians have survived have made huge efforts to preserve their culture and history among their tribes, which is extremely important, right? So here is a picture to just show you guys just how diverse just in California all of the tribes were, how many different tribes there were at the time and where they existed, right? So a lot of what we see in like the Sierra foothills, like the Sierra Miwok, the Nishanan, the Maidu, and Washoe, and more, right? But when we look at some of the historic areas, grinding stones and parks that are around our area, we hear a lot of these names and these tribes be brought up, right? There were a lot more in California, and I'd love to learn about all of them. It's super interesting to know what their specialties were, what their languages were like, what their cultural experiences or traditions were like, right? But we don't have a lot of that information, unfortunately. And like we mentioned, not a lot of these people survived, so it's very tragic, it's very sad, but there's a history there, and it's good that we respect it and we bring it up, right? Okay, so there actually was a grapevine already in California before we started planting these imported European species. So it's called Vitis californica is the genus and species of this grapevine, and it's native to California, of course, but we can't really make wine out of this. We've tried, it doesn't make very good wine, but this grapevine did play a really important role before Spanish colonization and before any Europeans came to California, modern day California, right? So when we look at how Native Americans or even any culture interacted with plants around them, native species, there's a really interesting scientific term, and this was new to me, so I was really excited to share this. It's called ethnobotany. So it's the scientific study of how people from different cultures and regions interact with, utilize, and understand indigenous plants. It acts as a bridge between the natural and social sciences, combining botany, anthropology, ecology, pharmacology to document how flora is used for medicine, food, shelter, and spiritual rituals. So I thought that was super interesting because in the like UC Davis like science perspective of like, oh, Vitis californica is only good for a rootstock, right? We use it because the roots of that plant have adapted to the soils of California, so it's typically resistant to phylloxera or other types of species, right? But I never thought of it on the perspective of like what was the use of this plant before, or in different sites, not just in wine, right? So this was an extremely important plant to have. So it typically grew around riverbeds and streams. Once it was established, it could easily thrive on its own. It is a vine, so it is a structural parasite, right? So it can grow anywhere from 6 to 60 feet tall, can completely take over different structures of plants or buildings. So in that way, the grapevines are kind of a pest in my perspective as well, right? But native tribes would use this grapevine they'd consume the berries for fresh fruit or food, right? They would make baskets out of the vines, threads and cords. There's even records of snowshoes being made that they'd like weave it together and make some snowshoes for travel, house construction, and even boat moors. So the house construction I thought was really interesting. So this is a picture of a Miwok ceremonial roundhouse that was under construction in 2015. So this was taken from the USDA California Wild Grape site, which I have here linked if you'd like to read more about it. So what they had done is they had taken logs and lined them up. Then they had harvested grapevine from the wintertime when it was woody. Then they actually soaked it into the lake, left it in the water so that way it would stay pliable over winter. And then they weaved it to create this like ceiling of rafters, right? And then they would use leaves and stuff to, seal up any of the cracks to create some insulation and some protection. But the roundhouse is a ceremonial area where they would do a lot of spiritual rituals. But I thought it was really interesting how, like, again, the perspective of like, oh, grapevines for wine, instead of just being like, oh, well, it was used for lots of other things too, obviously. So yeah, ethnobotany, that's the word of the day. Okay, so that's kind of a background of the native grapevines in California, and now we're kind of going to move into European vines and how they came to California, and then how it took off from there, right? So the actual like purposeful winemaking, those grapevines were transported over. It's credited that Hernan Cortez brought it over. It's stipulated, right? So he brought them from Europe to the New World as early as 1520. Spanish missionaries brought those Vitis vinifera cuttings from Mexico to California in the 18th century. Vines were planted at every mission to create sacramental wine for religious purposes, right? And the grapevines that were planted developed the name mission grapes because they were planted at missions. After some genetic testing, UC Davis was able to determine the actual grapevine's name as Listan Prieto, but mission is a very common name. We still use it today. And so here are some mission grapes in this photo. They're really different looking than any other grapes that we produce out here, especially for wine. They're just this really kind of light purpley, dusty color that's really gorgeous. And most other grapes don't have that color, so it's very rare. Interestingly enough, even though mission grapes came from Spain, it's not grown in Spain anymore. So the only surviving vines are basically in California. So we are like, California is the capital of Mission and Zinfandel grapes, and Zinfandel came from Croatia. So it's just kind of crazy that these species are dying out, and California is the last place that they're being planted and utilized. There are still a handful of wineries in California that are producing mission wine. And no, they aren't necessarily missions. They're actual just vineyards and wineries that are preserving the heritage and the history of this vine, which is really cool. Okay, so mission grapes were the only grapevines in California until the California Gold Rush began in 1848. So fast forward to the gold rush, hundreds of thousands of people coming to California after James Marshall discovered gold in 1848, right? We approximate 300,000 people came, right? And this isn't just from like Europe. This was also like China and Japan and all corners of the world. We had immigrants from all over. So it was California really, it started off as diverse from the Native Americans that were there. And then it became diverse with the wave of immigrants that came as well. So California has historically always been a state of mixed culture and backgrounds and immigrants, starting from the gold rush. So it's it's interesting to see how we identify ourselves sometimes, but it's always been a mixed bag from the beginning. So I think that's interesting. Okay, so with the gold rush and this huge influx of people coming to California, California was officially admitted to the Union as the 31st state of the United States in 1850. A lot of this was because of the huge influx of population, but also the government wanted to start taxing and making sure that they could claim a piece of the profit basically from that gold, right? So immigrants brought in grapevines with them to the Sierras. So we see a lot of Barbera and Zinfandel in this case, right? We always thought Zinfandel was Italian. Zinfandel is actually comes from Croatia. Primitivo is a clone of Zinfandel, and that comes from Italy, right? We'll talk about that more in the class. So for El Dorado County, for our area specifically, it's considered the heart of the Sierra foothills because of the gold rush beginnings here. So also El Dorado County was also the seat for a lot of legal things to go down, right? So that's why it's called Hangtown. The term Hangtown itself has a really mixed history and some sensitive subjects to it. We're not going to dive into that today, but essentially Hangtown was the gold rush name for the area, and then people later on adapted it and used it as for a more racist frame, which was really unfortunate and upsetting. But it does have like gold rush roots in the definition of the name, right? There are many other mining town names during the time too that still exist, like Fairplay and Murderer's Bar and Pokerville. So those are still areas that you can find. They might not be commonly used. Like we don't call Placerville Hangtown anymore, thankfully, but they're still on a lot of signage and they have historical value. So, okay. Zinfandel easily became one of the most successful grape varieties during the gold rush. It's still one of the most planted in the Sierra foothills because, one, it grows very well. So Zinfandel is very hardy. It's very hard to kill it. It grows very well. It's very happy here. But the thing about it, too, is that you didn't just have to make wine out of the grapes. The grapes are very large and delicious and sweet, so a lot of people would just eat it as a table grape as well. We can't do that necessarily with all grapes that we produce wine out of. A lot of the other ones are smaller berries with a lot of seeds, right? And wouldn't be a good time. So because of this history, we still have a lot of surviving present day Zinfandel vines that are over 100 years old around El Dorado County, Amador County, and even Lodi as well. Okay, so consequences, right? We had all of these immigrants flooding in. California became a state officially under the United States. And with that, we saw a lot of laws coming into place where the immigrants and the country was making it their own. They kind of wanted to just get everyone else out, right? So we have, unfortunately, a new definition in our textbooks. Finally, it's the California genocide, and this was a state-sponsored campaign of violence and forced displacement of indigenous Californians from 1846 to 1873. So Native Americans had already suffered a huge loss. Even when like the Spanish missionaries came in, a lot of disease came through. Missionaries were forcing natives to change their culture, change their religions. And now we have this other huge influx of immigrants bringing in new diseases, but now actually being sponsored and encouraged by the states to drive them out. Basically, not even just drive them out, they would hunt them down like animals. It was horrible. So during this genocide, historians estimate anywhere between 9,000 to 16,000 California natives were murdered. In 1850, lawmakers passed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. Even though it says protection of Indians, this was not to protect Indians. This was actually to protect the European settlers from natives, essentially. And so they handed out, I think it was like $1.5 million in weapons, and they even had like bounties for heads. It was really upsetting. And also with this law, they legalized the indenturing of Native children in forced labor. So even though California was a slave-free state, when it became a state, this law made it possible for you to force Native American children into labor, right? So really upsetting history, right? And I'm sorry if this presentation seems like a downer. I just feel like there's a responsibility to talk about this. And also for me, I'll speak for myself, growing up in Placerville, I feel like we place a lot of value on the gold rush and even the wagon train, and we have all of these events and we have this like town identity of the gold rush, but there's no recognition of any Native American life before that. So I kind of felt lied to about that, and I think it's really upsetting, but I think we can do better, and I think starting to have the discussion that this happened is the first step. So anyways, not every presentation is going to be like this. Just because we're talking about the history of California, this is an important topic. So anyways. So when even though that horrible situation happened, right, it actually wasn't until 2019 that Governor Gavin Newsom formally apologized to California Native American leaders on behalf of the state for the atrocities and the systemic erasure. Okay. Fast forward to 2024, which wasn't that long ago, it actually became part of mandated education in the state of California that requires K-12 public schools to teach about the California genocide, including the mistreatment, but also the resilience of Native Californians, right? So it's a step in the right direction, right? The history of California did not start at the gold rush. It didn't even start with Cortez and the missions. There was a history long before that, centuries before that, that we don't know about because we tend to glorify these things, right? So I think it's interesting how things are changing, and I think it's good, right? Okay, so that was the consequences of the gold rush in California state. So that was happening in California, right? So fast forward, immigrants are coming, planting, making wine, selling wine as goods and services, as a commodity, right? Ultimately, the economy and population in California fluctuated because not everyone was making a ton of money in gold like they thought they would. They weren't achieving the dream or the life that was advertised to them when they came to California, right? So a lot of people moved out of the state, went to other mining endeavors like silver and other things. Maybe they started businesses just to try to get by. Maybe they had like sheep or cattle or produce, milk or wine or other services, right? Or maybe they became cobblers, right? So many things, right? Anyways, so fast forward, we see a lot of industrialization and we see prohibition. So prohibition was the 18th Amendment, and it took place from 1920 to 1933. So 13 years. For 13 years, it was illegal to consume, create, transport, and sell alcohol, right? So a small number of vineyards and wineries survived by making sacramental wine for churches, or they would sell wine bricks and grape concentrate to home winemakers, right? So there was like a loophole in the law where you could make up to like 6 gallons or something at home for private use. I don't know how that became an exception to the law, but some people were doing that, right? But also with those wine bricks, it would have like instructions like, do not mix with 5 gallons of water. Do not add yeast because alcohol will be formed if you do that. So like it was obviously like the instructions to make wine at home, but what are you going to do? So a lot of vineyards at this time switched to planting thick-skinned grapes that would ship well because of this. And so Alicante Bouschet was on the rise. Alicante Bouschet is a variety you can still get at some wineries today. Bumgarner makes it. I know for sure they do. But because of this, right, with the downfall of wineries and downfall of sale, the overall quality of wine degraded hugely, right? So here's a picture of these gentlemen having to pour their alcohol down the drain. Cops found them, and so it's got to go, right? Cool. So that was like 1920, 1933. After Prohibition had ended, we see the birth of the bulk wine era, right? So quality of wine was not very good, right? And also there wasn't a demand for wine. A lot of images that we see is in demand for hard liquor and for beer from Prohibition. So wine had to basically find its place and find its foothold in this new era, right? So 30s to 50s, the industry started building a footing by making sweet port style wine that was extremely cheap. And these were called jug wines because they would come in a big handle like this, a jug, right? You can actually still buy this. These sell this at like Save Mart, Safeway, Total Wine. There might not be a huge selection, but I bet they have at least one, and it's super cheap, right? And it's going to be sweet. So interestingly enough, San Joaquin Valley in California earned the name jug wine capital of the world because of how much they produced during this time, right? So during this time, we saw like a lot of like 50s housewives drinking wine. I think this is like a stereotype of when women started becoming the consumer of wine because it was cheap, it was sweet, and that's what they consumed, right? So wineries at this time were really struggling to find their footing until UC Davis Department of Viticulture and Enology stepped in, and they shared research on modern sanitation techniques. They observed and did research on California microclimates. So this is when we like reference the Winkler scale, Amarine and Winkler. Those were top researchers at UC Davis at the time. And we talk about like what grape varieties do best depending on where they are on the Winkler scale for microclimates in California. They developed that, right? So that information wasn't around until they researched and developed that at this time, right? And so their names are still on the textbooks of some of the major winemaking and grape growing literature today that we still use, which is really cool. So for the bulk wine era, here's an image from California Wine Selector, and they're using a lot of foreign names of like European specialty wines to sell their own, basically, right? So this is like California Port, California Sherry, California Sauterne, right? So these are all sweet wines, right? Well, it says this Burgundy is not sweet, sorry. But most of these are sweet wines, and here was a guide of what to expect, what to pair with, and how to serve it, which was really cool too, from the 50s. Okay, so going from the bulk wine era, next we have what's called the Renaissance, right? And so this is the 60s and 70s. So in the 70s, UC Davis continued to put out more and more research into improving the quality of wine, right? So wineries around California were starting to make better wine. Some people were graduating from Davis with this program. People were coming, like descendants of families who are really starting to figure it out, right? So people were making higher quality wines at this point. And the event that gave credit to the entire, country, but like California and Napa specifically, is called the Judgment of Paris of 1976. So this is when there was a blind tasting in France, and a handful of American wineries set out their wines to compete, and America won for Chardonnay and for Cabernet Sauvignon. So Bottle Shock, the movie, is based off of Chateau Montelena winning with their Chardonnay. Stag's Leap won for Cabernet Sauvignon. There were a handful of other wineries that were involved. You can actually find the scores on Wikipedia and everything. It's really interesting. But this was like the scandal of the century when this happened. Like there were French judges that were like demanding to have their ballots back. They couldn't believe, that California wineries had, tricked them, and they just could not believe it, right? And even for years, France was in denial that this had kind of even happened, right? There was one reporter there who was able to bring that information back to the United States and announce it to the country, which was really exciting, right? So this is the landmark event that really showcased that California was making high quality wines, right? So in respect to the Sierra foothills and the local area, this is where we see a lot of post-Prohibition wineries starting to take fold. And these are a lot of the founding fathers of the area for the Sierra foothills. So Boger, Sierra Vista, Saban, also the Shenandoah Vineyards, Madronia, and Cooper, right? And so some of these wineries have historic winemaking sites on them. So Boger has an historic site, and so does Saban. You can visit both of them. They're really cool. So that just means that there was a winemaking site there basically during the gold rush, which is really cool. So yeah, that was the Renaissance. Things were good, right? So that was kind of the spark of this modern era, right? So after the 70s and 80s, we start to see this expansion and modern era, right? So there's a huge period of growth in wine in California. Tourism was hopping. The government started to develop California wine, just wine AVAs, not just California, but for the entire country. So AVA is how we label our appellations in the United States, and it stands for American Viticultural Area. So it's a government recognized area for producing grapes for wine, right? So it's deemed as like a quality area. People were buying wine. We also saw the development of the wine cooler. So even though this looks like a beer bottle, this is a wine cocktail beverage, right? So California Cooler Spring Break, 1984, right? So big success in that. And also a lot of wineries were founded during this time, and businesses saw a lot of success in general. Fast forward to the recent structural decline. The decline started in 2017, and that's when retail sales and production volumes peaked, but started a downward trend right as of 2017. So 2024 to present. So 2017 to 2024 is really a bizarre time because we had the pandemic. So the statistics are kind of an anomaly for that area because a lot of businesses were shut down, but a lot of people were drinking at home due to stress of of COVID-19. There's a lot of news going around. People were very concerned. It's something that, we had never gone through in our lifetime before. So people were drinking more alcohol with businesses shut down. So it's really hard to draw conclusions about a period like that. We didn't really know what was happening with the wine industry because we didn't know what was happening with the world, right? So 2017 to 2024, kind of a bizarre time, right? So in 2024, we know for sure we saw a huge production crash. So California wine output plummeted by 17.1% to its lowest level since 1999, right? So growers ripped out 40,000 acres of vines. Hundreds of thousands of tons of fruit were left to rot because there were no buyer contracts, right? So huge decrease in demand for wine. Alcohol in general is going through a crisis right now. The Surgeon General came out and made a statement saying no amount of alcohol is good for you, right? Whereas previously in the 90s, the Surgeon General had come out and said, oh, a glass of red wine is very good for heart health every night. So more information's come out, and alcohol is just not good for you in any respect, right? Metabolically, right? I would argue that there are some benefits, like everything in moderation, absolutely, right? And I think alcohol, especially wine, has really been like the source of community and socialization for so long. Like generally speaking, when we open a bottle of wine, we open it and we share it with someone, right? So there's something to be said about that tradition. But of course, everything in moderation, and please drink responsibly, right? So there's that. So according to industry reports from experts like Silicon Valley Bank, the market is currently working its way through a painful correction with demand and is expected to fully stabilize and recover between 2027 and 2028. So Silicon Valley Bank, fantastic resource for the state of the industry. Every year they release a massive report. I highly recommend you look into it if you're interested in how business is going for the wine industry. But it's just an interesting time. So I know this presentation has been kind of like doom and gloom a little bit. It's the reality of what the history was and what the industry is currently going through. With that said, I believe thoroughly that everything is cyclical. Do I think that California is going to produce as much wine as they did at their peak again? Probably not. But I don't think wine is going anywhere. And I think that, every generation will have its time, and every generation will have its beverage of choice, and things change as we get older. We develop new tastes and new interests in things. But this is also the time for innovation. This is the time for the wine industry to do something new and to change how things are going. So that's exciting in itself, right? So don't be discouraged, and everything's gonna be okay, right? But this is what the industry is going through right now, right? So for all of you that are still consuming wine safely and enjoying the local businesses, thank you for your service. Anyways, that pretty much wraps up where we are as far as the history of wine in this class. So as we move forward, we're going to go through more information on how to taste wine, wine sensory, food and wine pairing. This was a required student learning objective, so that's why we talked about it today. So anyways, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email, or I'll see you in class in person next week. I do have learning objectives. Oh, I skipped a thing. I do have learning objectives, but they're coming soon. Okay, here's just a graph to show you production figures, and this is linked to the Wine Institute in 2024, right? So sorry, I almost missed this. So this was U.S. wine production in California's changing share. So the orange bar is California's production, the blue bar is other states, and then this purple line, I'm not quite sure what this is. Shares. This might be like stocks potentially. Anyways, so total U.S. wine production peaked in 2017 at 891 million gallons before falling 27%. Excuse me. By 2024. California, once accounting for more than 90% of the U.S. total, dropped to 78.5% in 2024, its lowest share in more than 2 decades. Okay, see, so this is the share between California and the rest of the country, right? So Source Wine Institute and such, right? So if you want to look into the article behind this graph and where this graph came from, it's linked here, right? But as you can see, we start to see the share change between California and the U.S. because other states are making more wine, which was interesting, right? Which is cool. However, in 2017, this is the last part where this orange bar peaks for California, and ever since then, it's been on a downward trend, right? From there. So the share of what California makes compared to other states has dropped, actually going back to 2009. It's dropped significantly. So that is what we're seeing. Okay, awesome. Well, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I will upload these learning objectives soon, and I will see you guys next time.